He never read her last message. It was the ultrasound of his daughters. 4 years later, he saw them at the airport. Ethan Thorne had built his reputation on control, precision, and a refusal to let anyone or anything distract him from his ambitions. Every day of his life was a carefully orchestrated performance, a balance sheet of successes and acquisitions that left no room for weakness. His phone, always vibrating with messages and notifications, was an extension of that world, every word filtered, every conversation calculated for its potential value. So when a message from Julia flashed across his screen that night, his reaction was almost automatic. He glanced at her name, felt the sharp sting of the argument they'd last had, and without opening it, he placed the phone face down on his desk next to a stack of contracts awaiting his signature. In his mind, whatever she had to say could wait, or perhaps didn't matter at all. He had convinced himself she was part of a chapter that was already closing, a distraction from the empire he was still building. What he didn't realize was that this wasn't just another message in a long string of unfinished conversations. This one held an image that could have shattered the walls he'd built around himself, a revelation of a future he had never allowed himself to imagine. Inside was the ultrasound, black and white lines forming shapes both fragile and miraculous, proof of the daughters he already had and was refusing to know. Julia had written just a few words with it, words meant to bridge the silence between them, words that begged him to see beyond his pride. But he never tapped the screen, never let himself see. To him, the message was simply another reminder of a problem he didn't want to face, and by ignoring it, he believed he was protecting himself. Instead, in that single, careless choice, he condemned himself to years of emptiness he wouldn't even recognize until it was far too late. As Ethan buried himself in work, moving through the endless rhythm of meetings, contracts, and late-night strategy sessions, Julia sat alone, staring at the sent notification, waiting for the little indicator that he had read it. The minutes stretched into hours, the hours into days, and still nothing came. Each morning she woke up hoping for a response, some sign that he had opened his heart enough to understand. But the silence that returned was louder than any words could have been. She placed her hand on her stomach, whispering to the lives growing inside her, promising them they would never feel abandoned, that they would never grow up believing they were unwanted. The absence of his response told her everything she needed to know. Ethan, for his part, thought little of it. He told himself he had done the right thing by ignoring her, that he couldn't let himself be drawn into emotional entanglements that would make him weak. He believed an unread message was meaningless, just another discarded attempt from someone who no longer belonged in his world. He didn't notice how often his thoughts drifted back to her late at night, or how empty the silence of his penthouse seemed once the workday was done. He poured another drink, scrolled through reports, and convinced himself this was what strength looked like, moving forward without hesitation, without regret. He had no idea that regret was already there, just waiting to blossom, hidden in the words and image he had refused to see. And so time went on. Deals were signed, towers were built, and headlines praised the ruthless efficiency of Ethan Thorne. Yet underneath it all lay the weight of that one unopened message, a weight he wouldn't even feel until the day, years later, when he saw, with his own eyes, the 3 little girls who looked up at him with the same blue eyes he saw every morning in the mirror. Only then would he understand that the moment he turned his back on Julia's message, he hadn't just ignored her. He had ignored his daughters, and in doing so, he had set in motion a story far heavier than any deal he could ever make. Julia sat on the edge of her narrow bed, the phone's glare still burning in her eyes, even though the screen had long since gone dark. She had sent the message with trembling hands, attaching the ultrasound and typing words that had cost her every ounce of courage she had left. In her heart, she believed that once he saw it, once Ethan realized there was more at stake than his empire or his reputation, something inside him would crack open, and the man she had once loved would resurface. But as the hours passed and no response came, the knot in her stomach grew tighter. She refreshed her phone again and again, staring at the little icon that never lit up, the one that would tell her the message had been read. It remained stubbornly gray, and with every passing minute of silence, she understood more clearly than ever that she was on her own. The next few days were a blur of emotions. At first, she told herself there had to be an explanation. Maybe he was busy with meetings or traveling, or his phone had gone astray. She clung to these excuses, but reality chipped away at them mercilessly. Ethan never let anything slip by him in business. He noticed every detail, every opportunity, every threat. If he had wanted to read her message, he would have. If he had wanted to respond, he would have. That truth, simple and brutal, was impossible to deny. The man she had entrusted her heart to, the man whose blue eyes once promised her security and belonging, had chosen silence. Julia cried until her body ached, but when the tears were gone, determination took their place. She wouldn't beg again. She wouldn't send another message into the void. Instead, she poured her energy into survival, into preparing for the lives that were coming, whether Ethan chose to acknowledge them or not. The doctor's words still rang in her mind. Triplets, 3 tiny heartbeats blinking on the screen like fragile lights. And while the thought terrified her, it also filled her with a resolve she had never known. She hadn't planned this, hadn't asked to be left on her own, but she would rise to the challenge because she had no other choice. The months of pregnancy were the hardest of her life. Her body strained under the weight of carrying 3 children, every step heavy with exhaustion, every day a battle against fear. There were nights she woke up trembling, certain she couldn't do this alone, certain she would collapse under the pressure. But then she would press her hand against her stomach and feel the faint flutter of movement, and the reminder of what she was fighting for would give her strength. She worked as much as her body would allow, cutting back hours when the strain grew too great, relying on the kindness of neighbors in the small town she had fled to. With each passing month, Ethan's silence became less like a wound and more like scar tissue, hardening her heart, teaching her to stand without leaning on anyone else. When the day came, it was a chaos. The hospital room was filled with doctors and nurses, overlapping voices, machines beeping urgently as they brought 3 fragile lives into the world. Julia was exhausted, her body shaking from the effort. But when the cries of her daughters filled the air, she felt her chest burst open with a love so fierce it erased every doubt. Sophie, Liliana, and Amelia. 3 identical girls with dark, wet hair against their brows and piercing blue eyes that seemed to glow even in the harsh hospital light. As she held them against her, one by one, tears streamed down her face, not of pain, but of awe. She whispered to each of them that they were wanted, that they were loved, that they would never be made to feel like a burden. Those first few years blended into a haze of sleepless nights, endless feedings, and the constant juggling of 3 small lives who needed her completely. Julia worked when she could, slept when she could, and learned to live on pure willpower. Every smile from her daughters made the struggle worth it. Every giggle a reminder that her life still had light. There were moments of despair, moments when bills piled up or sickness hit, when the loneliness gnawed at her. But she never regretted her choice. Ethan's silence had forced her to uncover a resilience she never knew she possessed. And while the pain of his rejection lingered, it no longer defined her. By the time the girls were 4, Julia had created a world for them filled with laughter and stability, even if it lacked luxury. They knew bedtime stories and warm hugs, not the ache of absence. And though Julia sometimes wondered how she would one day answer their inevitable questions about their father, she pushed those worries away for now. She had survived his silence and had built a family without him. What she didn't know was that the man who had once ignored her message would soon see his own life shattered by the sight of what he had lost, and that their paths, however separate they seemed, were destined to collide again. Ethan Thorne's life in those 4 years was an endless climb up the ladder of power, and yet the higher he climbed, the lonelier the air became. The world looked at him and saw a man who had it all: wealth that spanned continents, influence that made governments take his calls, and a reputation so formidable that rivals rarely dared to cross him. His image graced magazines, his name was whispered with admiration and envy at gala dinners, and his sharp blue eyes became a symbol of ruthless success. But when the lights went down and the applause faded, he returned each night to an apartment that echoed with emptiness, its glass walls reflecting not triumph, but isolation. He had silenced the one person who had loved him unconditionally, and though he told himself he had made the right choice, the silence of his penthouse told another story. At first, Ethan managed to bury any lingering thoughts of Julia under layers of work. He convinced himself she had moved on, that whatever message she had tried to send was just another plea he was right to ignore. He signed bigger deals, expanded his company into new markets, and sat at tables with kings and presidents. Yet sometimes, when exhaustion weighed on his shoulders, he would find himself scrolling through old photos of her. He'd remember the way her laugh used to soften the hardest days, the way her blue eyes once looked at him as if he were more than his empire. Those memories came to him like ghosts, unwanted but persistent, and no matter how many times he locked them away, they returned. The irony was not lost on him. He had told himself that walking away from Julia meant freedom, that rejecting any future she carried meant he was preserving his strength. Instead, what he felt most often was the strange weight of something missing. He had built towers, but they gave him no warmth. He had surrounded himself with admirers, but none of them knew how to touch the hollowness in his chest. On the rare nights he allowed himself to wonder, he'd question if her message had been something more than a demand, if he had walked away from something he might one day regret. But pride was a fortress he had built too high, and he wouldn't allow himself to climb down. It wasn't until the 4th year that the cracks began to show in that fortress. Ethan was in an airport, returning from yet another sealed deal abroad. His thoughts centered on the speech he would give to the board that evening. The terminal was crowded, full of travelers dragging luggage and children laughing, and he moved through them with the detached gait of a man who believed himself to be separate from ordinary life. And then, as if fate had orchestrated it with cruel precision, he saw her, Julia. Her blonde hair gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and she moved with the quiet strength of someone who had weathered storms. His breath caught, but before he could process the sight of her, his eyes landed on the 3 little figures walking at her side. 3 little girls, no older than 4, holding hands as they followed their mother. Their hair was dark, their faces nearly identical, and when one of them looked up at him, Ethan froze. He knew those eyes. They were his. 3 pairs of piercing blue eyes stared at him with innocent curiosity, and in that moment, the walls of his carefully constructed life came tumbling down. The unread message crashed into his memory like a blow, and the truth he had denied for years stood before him, undeniable and alive. They weren't coincidences. They weren't strangers. They were his daughters. For the first time in his adult life, Ethan felt his knees go weak. The man who could negotiate billion-dollar deals with unshakable calm suddenly found himself unable to breathe. He had missed everything. Their first words, their first steps, their first years of life, and no amount of power or wealth could rewind time. His chest tightened as guilt, sharp and suffocating, washed over him. He remembered every excuse he had made, every reason he had used to justify his silence, and realized how meaningless they all were now. He hadn't just ignored Julia. He had abandoned his own children. Julia's gaze found his, and the look in her eyes was enough to cut him to the bone. There was no softness there, no warmth, only a quiet, guarded fury born of 4 years of surviving without him. She held her daughter's hands tighter, her posture protective, as if shielding them from the very man who had given them life. Ethan wanted to speak, to explain, to beg, but the words were caught in his throat. All he could do was stand there in the middle of the crowded airport, watching the family he had thrown away walk past him as if he were nothing more than a stranger. That night, long after he had returned to his sterile apartment, Ethan sat alone in the dark, his reflection in the window fractured by the city lights. The girls' faces haunted him. Their hair, their eyes, the way they had held on to their mother. For the first time in years, he admitted the truth he had buried. His empire meant nothing without them, and though he didn't yet know how, he swore to himself that he would not walk away again. The daughters he had refused to see had found him, and now he would do whatever it took to earn even a sliver of their trust. Ethan couldn't erase the image of the airport from his mind. Every detail replayed with brutal clarity. The way Julia's hand had tightened around the 3 little ones, the protective wall she had built with her body as soon as she saw him, and the girl's piercing blue eyes that had stopped his heart with a single glance. He sat in board meetings, signed contracts, and shook hands with officials, but nothing reached him. The words blurred into meaningless sounds, the numbers became indistinguishable shapes on the page, and every room felt colder than before. For the first time in years, Ethan felt powerless, and it terrified him more than any hostile takeover or looming scandal. At night, when the silence filled his penthouse, he poured drink after drink, but found no solace in the burn of the expensive scotch. Instead, he stared out at the glittering skyline, remembering the way one of the girls had tilted her head, studying him with innocent curiosity. That look undid him more than Julia's fury ever could have. It wasn't judgment or hatred. It was just simple, childlike wonder, and yet it carried a weight that crushed him. He had once convinced himself that severing ties with Julia was to protect his freedom, to ensure he would never be weakened by emotional obligations. But now, standing on the precipice of this revelation, he realized that freedom had been nothing but a cage. He had locked himself inside his empire, and on the other side of the bars, 3 lives had grown that belonged to him. The days following the airport encounter became a torment. Ethan found excuses to drive by that same terminal, hoping to catch another glimpse of them, even though he knew it was unlikely. He instructed private investigators to find out where Julia lived, what her life had become, and within days, he had the answers neatly laid out in a folder on his desk. He stared at the photographs more than he should have, his throat tightening as he studied the life she had built without him. There was a small house with peeling paint, a modest car parked in front, and 3 girls playing in the yard, their laughter captured in frozen frames. Julia was among them, her hair pulled back in a simple bun, her face etched with fatigue, but also radiant in a way none of his photographs ever had been. It hit him with cruel force that she had done it on her own, without his money, without his support, without even his acknowledgement. And she had succeeded where he had failed. She had built a family. Guilt ate at him mercilessly. He remembered the last words he had said to her, the indifference with which he had dismissed her fears, the pride that had driven him to ignore her message. He had thought himself invincible then, untouchable, as if money and power set him above the responsibilities of ordinary men. Now he understood he hadn't risen above anything. He had simply fallen further, into a void that left him empty and bitter. He had thought ambition would protect him, but it had instead stripped him of the only thing that mattered. And what made it worse was that the damage could not be undone. Those girls had lived 4 years without him. They had said their first words, taken their first steps, celebrated birthdays and holidays with only their mother by their side. He had missed it all, and nothing he did could ever give it back. One night, unable to bear the silence any longer, Ethan drove to the neighborhood where Julia lived. He parked down the street, his expensive car glowing awkwardly among the modest vehicles lined along the curb. From the shadows, he watched them. The girls were running through the yard chasing each other, their voices high and musical, while Julia stood on the porch with her arms crossed, doling out warnings and laughter in equal measure. Ethan gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles went white, every muscle in his body urging him to get out, to cross the distance, and to tell them who he was. But fear stopped him. He had faced boardrooms of hostile investors without a flinch. He had looked down the most ruthless competitors in his industry. But this, approaching the woman he had betrayed and the daughters he had abandoned, this made him tremble. When Julia finally guided the girls inside, Ethan remained in the car, his chest hollow and aching. He realized that simply watching from a distance would not be enough, that the ache in his chest would not fade until he had spoken the truth out loud. He no longer cared about pride, about image, about what anyone might say. All that mattered were those 3 girls and the woman who had carried them on her own. He whispered their names to himself, learned from the investigator's report: Sophie, Liliana, and Amelia, as if repeating them might summon the courage he needed. And as he drove back to the city that night, Ethan knew one thing with absolute certainty. The man who had once ignored a message could no longer remain silent. He had to face the storm he had created, even if it destroyed him. Because only through that storm could he hope to find a way back to the family he had never stopped needing. Ethan spent days gathering the courage to reach out. But when the moment finally came, it was nothing like he had rehearsed in his mind. He had imagined long speeches, carefully crafted explanations, even apologies that sounded almost noble. But when he finally stood across from Julia again, none of those words seemed right. And all the polish of the businessman who had once commanded entire boardrooms with a single glance crumbled to dust. He had called ahead, leaving a message on her doorstep, unsure if she would even respond, and when she agreed to meet him at a quiet cafe in town, he had almost convinced himself she wouldn't show up. But she did. She arrived with her hair pulled back, her face bare of makeup, her eyes steady but cautious, as if every step toward him was one she already regretted. The silence between them at the table was thick, and Ethan struggled to find words that didn't sound like excuses. Julia, however, didn't give him the chance to set the terms. She leaned forward, her voice quiet but sharp, as she asked the question that had burned for 4 long years. Why didn't you read it? For a moment, Ethan couldn't breathe. His entire body tensed, as if the weight of the past had collapsed on him in a single instant. He opened his mouth and closed it again, realizing that nothing he could say would ever erase the truth of what he had done. Still, he forced the words out. He admitted that he had been a coward, that his pride had made him believe he could just ignore the parts of life that scared him, that he had thought pretending the problem didn't exist would make it go away. His voice cracked as he confessed that he had been wrong, that not a day had gone by since the airport, that he hadn't been haunted by his daughter's eyes staring back at him. Julia listened without interrupting, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. When he finally finished, she shook her head slowly. "You don't get to just show up now and expect me to open the door just because you're sorry," she said. Her words were firm, but Ethan could hear the tremor of old wounds beneath them. "I was at every doctor's appointment alone in that hospital room when they were born, alone on every sleepless night, every scraped knee, every question I didn't know how to answer. You weren't there, and they don't know you exist. Do you understand what that means?" Her words wounded him more deeply than any corporate defeat, and for the first time, Ethan felt the full weight of the years he had lost. He tried to explain that he didn't want to erase her strength or pretend he could undo the past, but that he wanted to begin, however late it was, to be present in his daughter's lives. He told her that he had nothing left to hide behind, that his money and power felt meaningless without them, and that he would give it all away if it meant a single chance to earn their trust. His voice broke as he added that he wasn't asking her to forgive him for what he had done to her, because he knew some wounds could never heal, but he begged her not to punish the girls by keeping them from their father. The conversation grew heated. Julia's eyes filled with tears, not of weakness, but of rage and exhaustion. She accused him of trying to reclaim a place in a story he had abandoned, of thinking he could just walk in and be a father after years of silence. Ethan didn't argue. He let her anger wash over him because he knew she deserved every word. For years, he had lived untouched by consequences, always one step ahead of anyone who dared to challenge him. But here, across from Julia, he sat stripped of all defenses, exposed in a way that made him feel smaller than he had ever been. Finally, when the storm of her fury calmed, a fragile silence fell between them. Julia wiped her cheeks and said softly, "They don't even know what a father is. To them, it's just a word. If you want to change that, I'm not the one you have to convince. It's them. And you'd better be ready to fight for them harder than you've fought for anything in your life." She stood to leave then, her hand tight around her purse strap, and Ethan knew she was giving him something rare, a chance, however small, to prove himself. That night, Ethan lay awake in his penthouse, staring at the ceiling as her words repeated in his mind. For the first time in years, he felt a strange clarity. His empire could crumble, his fortune could disappear, and none of it would matter compared to the opportunity to be by his daughter's side. He knew the road ahead would not be quick or easy. He would have to tear down walls built with years of absence and distrust. But he also knew one thing with absolute certainty. For Sophie, Liliana, and Amelia, he wouldn't stop trying, even if it took him the rest of his life. Ethan's first real attempt to enter his daughter's lives came on a Saturday morning, one of those crisp, early autumn days when the air held as much warmth as it did chill. Julia had grudgingly agreed to let him meet them, not in private, but in a crowded park, where the safety of distance was always available to her if things grew too heavy. He arrived early, his usual calm replaced by nervous energy, pacing near the swings like a man waiting for a judgment. For once, the polished image of a CEO seemed to fall away, his suit replaced by a simple sweater and jeans, his hair slightly disheveled, his eyes betraying the sleepless night before. He looked less like a mogul and more like a man terrified of failing the most important meeting of his life. When Julia appeared, holding the small hands of 3 girls who looked so much alike it was as if they had been cut from the same star, Ethan almost lost his breath. Sophie, Liliana, and Amelia. They wore matching jackets, their dark hair catching the sunlight, their blue eyes moving with curiosity and laughter. They clung to their mother at first, giggling as they tried to guess who the tall man waiting for them could be. Julia crouched down and whispered something, her hand stroking their hair, and then looked at Ethan with a gaze that held as much warning as it did surrender. She stepped aside slightly, giving him space, though her presence loomed as both protector and witness. Ethan knelt so as not to tower over them, his knees sinking into the grass, his hands shaking as he held them out without expectation. For a moment, the girls just studied him. One tilted her head, just as she had at the airport. Another moved behind her sister, and the third bit her lip in quiet concentration. Ethan's voice cracked softly as he said, "Hi, my name is Ethan, but you can call me Daddy if you'd like." The word felt foreign to him, yet it spilled out with a longing he couldn't contain. The girls exchanged glances, and then, with the innocence only children possessed, Sophie took a step forward. She touched his hand lightly, as if testing if he was real, and then whispered, "Do you like swings?" The question broke the tension. Ethan laughed, a sound that was unpolished and raw, and replied, "I love swings. Maybe you can show me the best one here." Within minutes, all three were running forward, pulling him toward the playground, their little voices filling the air. He pushed them one by one, his heart swelling with every shriek of laughter, his chest aching with the realization that he had missed years of this. Julia stood at a distance, her arms crossed, watching as her daughters accepted the man she had long hated, not with wariness, but with the simple openness of children who crave to be loved. As the morning wore on, Ethan learned details that pierced him with both joy and pain. He discovered that Liliana loved to draw animals, that Amelia wanted to be a singer, and that Sophie was the one who always insisted on telling her sister's bedtime stories, even when she was tired. They talked about their favorite colors, their dislike of broccoli, and the silly games they invented together. Each revelation was a gift, but also a reminder of all he had missed. He listened intently, storing every word like a treasure, for he knew that for once, nothing mattered more than this. When it was time for lunch, Julia spread a blanket under a tree, and Ethan sat with them. Clumsy at first, but slowly fitting into the rhythm of their chatter. One of the girls climbed into his lap without hesitation, clutching a sandwich as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He froze, afraid to breathe, overwhelmed by the weight of the small body against his chest. Julia's eyes softened for the first time in years as she watched him, though her expression hardened quickly again as he met her gaze. She wouldn't forgive easily, and he didn't expect her to. But the simple fact that she had allowed this day to happen filled him with a gratitude he couldn't articulate. As the sun dipped lower, Julia gathered the girls and prepared to leave. Ethan's chest tightened with panic, the fear that this fragile connection might end as quickly as it had begun. He stood, his voice trembling as he told Julia, "Thank you for today. You don't know what this means to me." She held his gaze, her expression unreadable, and replied, "You'll have to prove it's not just for today." With that, she took the girls' hands and they waved goodbye, their laughter still lingering in the air as they disappeared down the path. Ethan remained in the park long after they were gone, sitting alone on the swing set, where their laughter still echoed. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a CEO or an industry king. He felt like a man who had been given a second chance at something he once threw away. And as he watched the empty swing sway gently in the breeze, he swore that he would not let this opportunity slip through his fingers. If it took him years of patience, humility, and persistence, he would spend every moment proving to Sophie, Liliana, and Amelia that their father was not just a title, but a promise. Ethan's life began to change in ways he hadn't anticipated after that day at the park. For years, he had been a man consumed by schedules, investors, and the relentless pursuit of profit. But now he found himself rearranging entire board meetings just to make sure he could attend a school recital or a soccer practice. His assistants whispered about how unusual it was for him to cancel dinners with foreign dignitaries in favor of spending an evening in a modest suburban neighborhood. Yet he no longer cared. He found that power no longer held the same weight it once did, because every time he entered that small world Julia had built, he realized it was here that life truly happened. The skyscrapers he had built seemed smaller in comparison to the joy he felt when 3 pairs of blue eyes lit up at his arrival. Still, the road was not smooth. Julia remained wary, often standing with her arms crossed, as if reminding him with every gesture that her trust was not a prize to be won easily. She watched him closely, testing his patience, waiting to see if his persistence was genuine or just another performance like the ones he had mastered in the corporate world. Ethan didn't fight her scrutiny. He welcomed it, knowing he had earned every ounce of her suspicion. When she told him he could join them for dinner, but only if he brought nothing but himself, no extravagant gifts, no attempts to buy affection, he obeyed. That night, he sat at her worn wooden table eating spaghetti with her daughters, laughing when one of them spilled sauce on his shirt, and realizing this simple, imperfect meal meant more than any banquet he had ever attended. Santiago, his trusted right-hand man at the company, noticed the change too. "You're different," he told Ethan one morning as they prepared for a crucial negotiation. "You used to walk into a room like you already owned it. Now you seem to have something to lose." Ethan just smiled faintly, not bothering to deny it, because for the first time in his life, he did have something to lose. 3 little girls who had become the heartbeat of his world, and the woman whose strength both intimidated and inspired him. He worked harder than ever, not to build taller towers or bigger deals, but to ensure his daughters would never know the insecurity and absence he had imposed on them in their early years. The girls, too, began to shift with his presence. At first, they treated him as a novelty, someone new to play with, but they soon began to expect him. They saved drawings for him, ran to him at the park, and asked when he would be back. One night, Sophie climbed into his lap and asked if he would read her favorite bedtime story. He looked at Julia for permission, and though her lips were tight, she nodded slightly. Sitting there with the book open and 3 small heads resting on him, Ethan felt a wave of emotion so fierce it almost undid him. At first, he stumbled over the words, but by the time he reached the final page, his voice was steady, and when he looked up, he found Julia watching him with a softer expression than he had seen in years. Despite these moments, the weight of his past choices hung heavily over him. One afternoon, while walking the girls home, Amelia tugged on his hand and asked with childlike honesty why he hadn't been there when they were born. The question wounded him more deeply than any accusation, because there was no answer that could make sense to a child. He melted, tears threatening, and whispered, "Because I made a mistake. The worst mistake of my life. But I promise you I'm here now, and I'll never leave again." Amelia looked at him for a long moment before nodding and running ahead, but Ethan carried the weight of that question with him, knowing it would take him years to prove the truth of his promise. As the weeks passed, Julia began to notice the small consistencies in his behavior. He showed up when he said he would. He never complained when the girls demanded his time. He learned the details of their routines, remembering which stuffed animal each one needed to fall asleep, which one disliked peas, and which one liked her hair braided differently each morning. These were things he had once dismissed as trivial, yet now they were sacred to him. Tiny pieces of proof that he was finally becoming the man he should have been all along. One night, while the girls slept and the house grew quiet, Ethan remained in the living room while Julia cleaned up the kitchen. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, and he finally broke the silence. "I know I can't undo what I've done," he said, his voice low and serious. "But I will spend the rest of my life showing you and them that I can be better. Not the man who ignored you, not the man who thought his pride mattered more than love. I want to be their father, and I want to earn the chance to be by your side, not as a stranger, but as the man who should have been there all along." Julia didn't reply right away. She set down the dishcloth and looked him in the eyes, her expression unreadable, caught between the scars of the past and the fragile hope of something new. At last, she said, "You're not forgiven. Not yet. But I see you trying, and for now, that's enough." Ethan nodded, a quiet wave of relief washing over him. It wasn't redemption or absolution, but it was the first real step towards something he had believed lost forever. And as he left the house that night, the sound of his daughter's soft breathing echoing in his mind, he realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing a deal or a title. He was chasing the opportunity to be worthy of love, and for that, he would never stop running. Spring arrived quietly, and with it came a sense of renewal that Ethan hadn't felt in years. The sharpness of winter melted away, and as the days grew longer, he found himself being welcomed into more of the moments that once felt forever denied to him. Julia still maintained her emotional distance, but she no longer shut the door. The girls had woven him into their daily lives, and it was impossible not to notice the way their eyes lit up when they saw him, the way their laughter seemed freer when he was around. Ethan held on to these moments, not with the desperation of a man trying to prove himself overnight, but with the patient devotion of someone who understood that trust could only be built one day at a time. One Sunday morning, he arrived to take them all to the zoo. The girls buzzed with excitement, pulling at his arms, pointing to the map, demanding to see the lions first, and then changing their minds to the giraffes. Ethan let himself be pulled in all directions, marveling at the way they now seemed to know no boundaries with him. Julia walked beside him, her posture still cautious, but her eyes softer than before as she watched the scene unfold. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine that perhaps he wasn't just passing through, that maybe this man had finally chosen the life he once rejected. Later that day, as the girls collapsed in a heap of exhaustion, Ethan stayed in the kitchen with Julia. The house was dimly lit, quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, and the air between them thrummed with something unsaid. He finally broke the silence, his voice raw. "I used to think that being strong meant shutting people out, being in control of everything. But I see now that strength is holding on, even when it scares you, even when it hurts. I don't want to hide anymore. I want to be here, with them, with you, if you'll let me." His words carried no demand, just truth, and it was that honesty that made Julia's chest tighten. She studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of the man who had once walked away. Instead, she saw sincerity etched in every line, regret shadowing his eyes, and a kind of humility she had never believed possible for him. Her response was quiet, almost fragile. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget what happened, but I see the way they look at you, the way you look at them, I see you showing up, and maybe, just maybe, that's enough to start over, not as we were, but as something new. For Ethan, those words were more precious than any deal he had ever signed, more valuable than the billions attached to his name. He nodded slowly, a lump in his throat, and whispered, "I'll never stop proving it." In the weeks that followed, their lives began to entwine in ways that felt natural, even inevitable. Ethan learned to braid hair with clumsy fingers until his daughters laughed and corrected his mistakes. He burned pancakes on Sunday mornings, but kept trying until the kitchen was filled with smoke and laughter. He knelt on the floor to help with puzzles, sat in tea parties with stuffed animals, and found himself captivated by the magic of their small world. With every moment, the girls grew surer of him, and with every glance, Julia's walls crumbled a little more. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but one night, as the sun set in streaks of gold across the sky, Ethan stood in the yard holding Sophie in one arm, while Liliana and Amelia clung to his legs, laughing uncontrollably. Julia leaned against the porch railing, her lips curved in the faintest of smiles, and in that quietness, Ethan felt something he had never known before. This was home. Not the penthouse with its panoramic views, not the boardroom with its endless victories, but here, among the laughter of 3 little girls and the steady presence of the woman he had once lost. He realized then that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, for the past would always remain. Redemption was about living differently now, about choosing every day to be the man they needed, the man Julia could finally learn to believe in again. And as the twilight settled over them, Ethan understood that even though he had once been a stranger, even though he had walked away from the very message that could have changed his life, he had been given a second chance. This time, he wouldn't squander it. This time, he would hold on. For the first time in his life, Ethan Thorne, the billionaire CEO who once thought himself untouchable, felt truly rich. And it had nothing to do with money. It had everything to do with the sound of his daughter's laughter and the fragile, but growing, trust in Julia's eyes. He had finally found the only empire worth keeping, and he would spend the rest of his days protecting it.